Okay, well, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Rhonda Brown. I'm the News Director at Global News in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I want to, first of all, thank RTDNA for helping us facilitate this conversation. They've generously helped us get the Zoom webinar underway, so thanks so very much for that. A very big and special thank you to the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma. I reached out to them with this idea and they jumped on it and helped bring our esteemed panelists together tonight. Esther Enkin is the Vice President of the Forum and a former ombudsman with CBC News. She's going to be our moderator tonight, and I'll throw it over to her to introduce our panelists.
You're muted.
Esther, you're muted.
I'm always afraid something, something will slip that shouldn't, so I mute myself till I'm ready and then I forget. Thanks, Rhonda. I'm really glad you did reach out, and I hope that everyone will find this this next hour or so helpful and supportive discussion as you face some really adverse times. I know COVID is just, working under COVID conditions and the protracted nature of that and the hours you're putting in, and your situation is just the base of what you've had to face individually and collectively. So we're going to explore a little bit about how that might feel and how others have felt about it, and some of the things you can do to make yourself feel better. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dave Seglins, who's an investigative journalist at CBC, who through his own experience with vicarious trauma has devoted time and attention advocating for recognition and support for the very real challenges that journalists experience in the course of their work. And so Dave, thank you so much for doing that. Dave was involved in the coverage of the trial of Colonel Russell Williams, who was convicted of a series of sadistic sexual murders. And by the way, as senior journalist at CBC at the time, I also ended up immersed in the ugly details, and I have some inkling of what that can do. Now Dave is a senior journalist with CBC's I Unit, and his most recent work has included investigations of Canada's national security and surveillance programs, railway safety, money laundering, and offshore tax havens. We'll hear from Dave first, and then from Dr. Feinstein, and I'll introduce him in a minute. And then Dave and Anthony, you can just take it away. And one other little bit of housekeeping. There is if you roll your mouse over the bottom, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this technology now, you'll see Q&A. If you have a question to one or the other of the panelists, you can direct it or just make it general. I will be watching them and try to aggregate the similar ones. And we'll leave a significant amount of time for you to be able to ask some questions. So with that out of the way, I'm going to quickly introduce Dr. Feinstein, tell you a little bit about him, and then hand it over to Dave. So Dr. Feinstein is at the University of Toronto and Sunnybrook Hospital. He's a neuropsychiatrist, best known in newsrooms for his leading work on the mental health of conflict journalists. He's the lead author of a study on the effects of vicarious trauma on journalists who work with user-generated content. The study covered 3 international news organizations. He's also the author of several books, including Journalists Under Fire, The Psychological Hazards of Covering War and Shooting War, 18 Profiles of Conflict Photographers. He's the author of many scholarly articles, many articles for the Globe and Mail. And if that's not enough, in 2012, a documentary Under Fire, produced by him and based on his research in war zones, was shortlisted for an Academy Award and received a Peabody Award in 2012. And as Dr. Feinstein says of himself, his day job is actually research into patients with MS. So this is totally remarkable. And I know from my years at CBC what a valuable resource he's been. And he's also a member of the board of directors of the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma. So enough of that. If you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function. That'd be the easiest, but you can also use the chat function. And with all that, I'm going to hand this over to Dave to start with some of his personal reflections. You're also muted. Dave, you're muted.
Yeah, of course. Of course I am. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for asking me to be here, and thanks, Esther, for the kind introduction. Trauma. Trauma is a big, scary word that I still almost don't associate with myself, if I can say that. I don't think of myself as a traumatized or sick person, but the reality is the work we do exposes us to, forgive my language because but crazy amount of shit in the world. And that has a residue, and that has an impact on all of us. If we weren't talking through Zoom and if we were in a room, I'd love to look around the circle to each of you and ask you how you're doing, and try to get a measure what you guys have been going through, because I know just from the news cycle, from what we see coming out of Nova Scotia, my heart goes out to you. You guys are working incredible long hours on these huge stories that are all crap. They're all death and horror shows and grief. And when I signed up for this exciting job to be a journalist, and I really always wanted to work, forgive the brand promotion here, but I always wanted to work at CBC, and it was such a dream. I was willing to do anything. And I still largely am willing to do anything, but I was so keen. I would take the horrible shifts. I would work the extended overtime. I would throw myself, I'd be the first person to put my hand up and get out the door, to go to stories that are about conflict most of the time. And some of the stories that we're all exposed to are just terrible. So I'm saying all of this as a preamble to kind of acknowledge and hope you guys are okay. But clearly, if you're taking part in this forum, you are thinking about trauma, and you're thinking about how is this affecting me. And I'm hoping that me sharing a little bit of my own story will go some distance. Maybe we can pull some lessons. But I really would like to get to questions and answers. Let me very quickly. So I used to be the kid in the newsroom. I still think of myself as the kid in the newsroom. I'm about 25 years in as a journalist. I'm clinging. I like to say I'm a haggard 49. My birthday, I turned 50 in 3 weeks. I've got 2 kids, and I'm still married, which is a miracle, given the kind of shift work that we do, given the decisions gotta leave the country, we're running out to do this. I've covered everything from City Hall to police to car accidents to plane crashes, to one of my big breaks early on was the Walkerton tainted water tragedy, where an entire town fell ill. Thousands of people were sick from drinking contaminated water. There were 7 people who died, including a child. I've covered complex issues around police corruption and found myself embroiled in investigations where I thought my phones were tapped. So you bring all of these stresses home. And stress. We have an incredibly stressful job. And like first responders, we are immersed in the details of these horrific stories, and it's just part of the job. And we're expected to let it roll off of us. And guess what? It doesn't. Some people have greater resilience. Some people don't. But we have all sorts of coping strategies, don't we? We have gallows humor, very dark humor in our jobs in newsrooms with colleagues that most people outside the business don't understand. And that's one way that we help cope. We also like to drink, a lot of us, where we, after long shifts or long horrible stories, we go out and we kind of wash away, at least I did. And that was all well and fine for a long time for me. But I'll tell you about my breaking point that then has brought me on a journey to kind of understand this in a different way. As Esther mentioned, I covered the Colonel Russell Williams case. It was a horrific tale about a military commander who started breaking into people's bedrooms in the middle of the night, and he escalated in his behaviors and wound up killing women and sexually torturing them. Horrible details that over the course of a crazy week of covering his sentencing, where reporters were in this horrible scenario of a courtroom for 8 hours a day and filing madly at every break and lining up early in the morning and filing late into the night, we were exposed to crazy details, video images, still images, just a horrific litany. And after the long filing, I would, go out with the other journalists and I would pound a few pints and try to make myself feel better. And then we would be up the next morning, and I would always be up at 4:30 so I could be at the front of the line because there was limited access and you wanted to make sure you got a seat in the courtroom. And so I pushed myself to the limit. All of this to say is that 2 days afterwards, I woke up in the morning and I couldn't move. I was terrified. I didn't know what was happening to me. I absolutely was frozen with fear and horror, and I couldn't understand really what it was, but I knew I was not okay. The good news is my work had reached out to a number of us, actually most of us who were covering it, saying, on occasion, we're just checking in. Are you okay? We know this is difficult. To be honest, I never felt comfortable really confiding in my colleagues and my managers, because guess what? I didn't want to say I wasn't okay, because I didn't want to be pulled off the story, because a measure of our worth is our ability to be there and soldier through and not let this stuff affect you. So I never really registered. I never took them up on their offers of a real discussion about whether I was okay. But here I was, days afterwards, at home, in bed, frozen, can't get out of bed. And they had said, we have EAP, Employee Assistance Program, and there's counseling available. So I took the CBC up on that. I took the EAP and I called the number, and I find myself very rapidly in a session with a specialist in trauma. And she uses this word. She says, "It sounds to me like you've had vicarious trauma." I was like, "Oh, not me. I mean, I wasn't the one affected. I didn't get killed. I'm just an observer." But it was the first time that I actually began to think critically about what it is, what we do to ourselves when we expose ourselves to this kind of shit all the time. And the language of vicarious trauma made me realize that we are participants in our stories. So you guys are going through all of this horrific coverage. You are participants. You are allowed to feel. You are going to have residue to varying degrees. But don't be shocked to find yourself thinking this through and the wheels turning and even being really disturbed by it. And why was I frozen in bed and unable to move? I was having basically a fright or flight, or what, I forget what the language is, response, where basically my system had been so wired to try to keep it together and persevere through all of this horror show of this week of coverage of this horrible sadomasochistic killer. And that when I finally released, my body just, my physical body couldn't take it anymore. And this therapist gave me the language to make me realize this is normal. Like, it is not normal to be exposed to these kinds of horrific stories all the time. That is not normal. Very few other professions, even the first responders that you are dealing with in your respective individual, they're not expected, well, some of them are expected to go to the next crash scene or the next murder investigation. But really, when you are exposed to these volumes and repeated and different kinds of traumas, and because you're reporting on other people's traumas, that's not really that normal. It's kind of normalized in our work, but it's not healthy. So that all began a journey for me where I began a lot of talk therapy. I got not that same counselor, but I got to a doctor, and a doctor said, I want you to talk to somebody. And I began doing psychotherapy, which was basically talking through this stuff. And lo and behold, not only is the work something that we have, but we're people. We have families. I've got dynamics with my children, with my partner. I also came from somewhere, right? I've got my lived experience. I had a lot of loss in my early life. I lost my father when I was 10 years old to a suicide. I lost a brother 15 years ago. And these are things that build up, and my experience in grief and trauma all intersect. So as you're going through and struggling through the way you're feeling about this litany of stuff that you're covering, know that your own personal experiences are going to weigh heavily into how you react. That's basically my conclusion. But I also, so through that, the talk therapy, I also had a couple of relapses. An instance where after a really crazy, another period news cycle where I was just working on so many different stories at once and deadlines, I crashed and I had a panic attack. Again, I went back to therapy and tried to think through, why am I having this panic attack? Basically, I burned myself out. My resilience got to like very little, to the point that I just couldn't do it anymore. And that is terrifying for a journalist, to think, maybe I can't do the job because this is what's expected. The good news is, I don't think that I'm disqualified from doing the job, but I have changed a lot in my life. I don't always go to every kind of story. It's a very difficult thing, especially if you're a younger journalist or earlier in your career, or you have job insecurity, and you really can't afford to tick off the news editor or the assignment editor. It's very hard to say, you know what, I don't want to do this next story about this horrible car crash or whatever. But you got to look out for you. Another thing that I did is that I decided that alcohol was actually not helping me. I have been a drinker my whole life. I love booze. Booze loves me. I love beer. I never wanted to be considered an alcoholic, but it was a constant presence in my life, and I was using it to medicate my stress. And it took me a really long time to realize that wasn't actually helping me cope with the stress. I wasn't actually, I'd wake up the next morning after having a couple of drinks, after having had a crazy work day, and I would like struggle through the first few hours of my day. And that wasn't helping. And so I adjusted that. I removed alcohol from my life with very few exceptions. I'm also on a medication for anxiety, which was diagnosed through having gone through a lot of the psychotherapy, but also in consultation with a psychiatrist. And it has fundamentally changed my life. It's fundamentally changed my capacity. And I still do stories on death. I still do complex, disturbing stories, but I'm way more in control of the stresses. And I think some of those lifestyle changes and having had the time and space to think these things through have equipped me now to approach these kinds of stories in a different and far healthier way. I have a few other notes in front of me that I wanted to get to, but I'm gonna kind of wrap up there. So the lessons I take from my own experience. So my advice to you is really take care of yourself. You've got to take the time to get exercise, get proper sleep, and maybe call your EAP or talk to your doctor if you are finding problems in your life. I was irritable at points. I would lash out in anger inexplicably in my relationships. And a lot of that, I would say, oh, I'm just stressed out. I got a lot of stress in my work. Well, that's not healthy. So figuring that out, you've got to take care of yourself because no one else will. And though workplaces are getting way better and we have a much greater literacy by newsroom managers to try to engage and talk about this, I, as a younger journalist, never really felt comfortable putting any of my cards on the table because I didn't want to be a wounded journalist who could only do half the job. That's the way I perceived it. And also, there's a struggle, right? You don't want to put too much of your own personal, mental, psychological health on the table with an employer. You have a right to privacy, and your employer doesn't really have a right to ask you about very intimate personal things. And so it's a bit of a struggle. And so I would say, try to find people that you can talk to. Yes, close colleagues, but people outside of your work environment. That's what helped me, and that's what I would advise. And I wished my family wanted to talk about all the horrors but my family weren't the right people either. So getting professional help, it was never something at the beginning of my career that I would say, wow, I'm really going to need a therapist by the end of this career. But it's the best thing I've done. Anyway, there is a very long sort of my experience, and I hope, oops, I'm just trying to find my Zoom window here. I'm hoping that's helpful, and I hope that may resonate. My experience is different. My base story, where I came from, my family experience, my resilience level is different. Yours is going to be different, and it may not be affecting you in a debilitating way. All I would say, as somebody who's now 25 years into a career, is that there are accumulated effects. So take the time when you're covering these really difficult stories to know that there will be residue, and really make sure that you've got the time and space, and I don't know, go for a jog, take care of yourself after these really difficult stories, and try to build into your larger work practice a way of taking care of yourself. Because if you don't, it catches up to you as it did for me. And there were some hard crashes for me that I wouldn't wish on anybody. There we go.
Dave, thank you so much. That's so authentic and so helpful and so generous of you to share vulnerability. Really appreciate it. Dr. Feinstein.
Yeah, thanks, Esther, and thank you for that, Dave. I mean, just for your powerful narrative and your honesty, and I think it's actually tremendous when a journalist of your stature gets up and talks like this, because in doing so, you help destigmatize things, and you, as you say it yourself, you normalize this experience. And in the past, it hasn't been normalized, which has prevented people from reaching out for help. So it's tremendous that you do this. I want to preface my remarks with a few comments on the pandemic, and then I'll move to talk about trauma. We've been fortunate in Canada. The pandemic has clearly had a devastating effect on our society, but our healthcare system hasn't been overwhelmed as it has in other countries. And over the last couple months, 2-3 months, I've been doing sessions with some American networks, those in journalist organizations in New York City, where the situation has been very different. And so I'd like to preface my trauma remarks with a few comments on the pandemic, because I think it's clearly still very relevant to us. And I'm conscious that you're doing your work against the background of this pandemic. So we realize now that 3 months into it, that the predominant emotion that people experience is one of anxiety. It's an age of anxiety. And we link that to the fact that there are so many things in our life that we cannot control. There's so many stresses. A little bit of stress is good for us. It gets us out the chair, it gets us going, it motivates us. But when you have one stress on top of another, that's when you find anxiety levels ratcheting upwards. And when you view that against all the things that we can't control in our life, it's easy to understand why anxiety is really so prevalent. So a useful first tip is this. it's not a good idea to focus on things that you can't control. Because when you do that, you use up your emotional resources. You run the risk of expending your emotional energy, whereas you need to conserve that for what's clearly going to be a long story. The pandemic has got a long way to play out yet. And so you want to be able to conserve your emotional resources. Don't waste those on thinking about things you can't control. And there's so many things you can't control. You can't control the infection, the economic news, the unemployment news, the stock market. You can't control rumors. You can't even control the behavior of your fellow citizens, most of whom are behaving well at a time like this and obeying social distancing, but we've all seen it. You go to the corner store, you go to a supermarket, and you come across people who don't behave this way, whose behavior potentially compromises all of us, and that can be upsetting. And so you need to shift your focus away from that. Don't get caught into this pattern of what we call catastrophic thinking, in which one negative thought runs into another. It's so easy to do this. You know, you wake up and there's the bad news about the infection rate or the mortality rate or the economic news, etc., and you find yourself stuck in a cycle of negative catastrophic thinking. So on the one hand, you've got all these things you can't control, but on the other hand, there are many things in your life that you can control, and Dave's touched on them. You know, devote time and energy to your sleep. Sleep is so important. Sleep nourishes us. When we wake up after a good night's sleep, we feel energized, our focus is better, our concentration is improved, we're in a better place to face the day. When you sleep badly, it's very different. And sleep is a very sensitive barometer of our emotional lives. We know that. The anxious person climbs into bed at night and has difficulty falling asleep because all these anxious thoughts are racing around. You can't shut them off, and you can lie awake for many hours before you drift off feeling exhausted. The person who becomes depressed, on the other hand, has a very different sleep pattern. You may want to sleep too much because you just don't have the energy. Or very typically, you have what we call early morning waking, in which you go to bed and you fall asleep without any difficulty, but you wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. and you just cannot get back to sleep. And you lie there in the dark with a sense of dread. You just cannot face the day. So sleep gives us a clue as to what's going on with our emotional lives. And remember that sleep obeys a biological rhythm, the circadian rhythm. We train ourselves to sleep a certain way because this is what our body wants. And one of the challenges of the pandemic, because we're working from home and our schedules are different, is that for some people, this sleep-wake cycle has gone out the window. You're staying up much later than usual, not going to bed at your usual time, and your body becomes confused and your sleep cycle suffers. So you can control your sleep. Look after your nutrition. What I found with journalists is that when you get very busy and time is precious, you kind of order in fast foods and you don't devote adequate time to eating and good nutrition. So don't do that. If you exercise, keep doing it. And if you haven't, start doing it. There's some really excellent 10-minute programs that you can download off the internet that are good for you. All you have to do is build up a light sweat, get a little bit of aerobic exercise. We know that exercise is good for you physically, but it's also good for you emotionally. And there's mounting evidence that it's good for you cognitively as well. It sharpens your focus, improves your attention. And at a time like this, when we have to obey social distancing and bureaus are closed, you've got to avoid social isolation. It's so easy to slip into this. And so build into your schedule time with friends. Make contact over the telephone. The New York Times have had some interesting and amusing articles like the good old-fashioned telephone is making a comeback, or the lost art of a telephone conversation. Stay in touch with your friends and your colleagues and with your elderly parents who you cannot see now. Make time for telephone calls and avoid social isolation. So you can see that there are many things in your day-to-day life that you can control. And there really was a great letter to the editor of the New Yorker a couple of months back in which a reader wrote in that the way to beat the stress of the pandemic is through respite. Respite as a form of resilience. And Dave touched on that. Build into your day those moments of respite when you go for a run, when you exercise, when you devote a bit of time to your meals, when you look after your sleep, when you spend time phoning your friends and your colleagues and your parents, when you listen to some music or do some yoga. These moments of respite are crucial. This is when the focus is on you, not on your work. You all have a tremendous work ethic, but you've got to put yourself center stage at times. The focus needs to be on you and your emotional health, because remember, you need to build up your resilience. This is going to be a long and difficult thing to endure. And given that you're on the front lines with your reporting, you've got to look after yourself. So these moments of respite as resilience are critically important to you. A couple other things, you've got to make sure, of course, that life goes on outside of the pandemic. You've got to devote time and energy to, paying your bills and, looking after your children, or making sure your appliances are working, or keeping your apartment clean. And so, don't neglect those things, because they're all part of life. And if you don't pay enough attention to them, things start falling apart. And the chaos of the pandemic becomes your personal chaos, which is bad for you. I learned one thing after 9/11, which I think is really relevant to this pandemic story. When I was invited down to New York to work with news organizations, I saw that in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, journalists were overwhelmed by the sheer horror of what had happened. But as the weeks went into months, I saw something else take place. I saw journalists working 18, 19-hour days. They were not sleeping enough because the story was so big. They had abandoned healthy eating habits. They were almost living in the bureau, so they weren't socializing and spending time with family. In short, all the building blocks of a healthy life were abandoned because this was such a big story. And in time, they became exhausted. They started to show features of burnout. I saw non-specific physical complaints starting to become prominent, things like the vague aches and pains, or a dull headache, or some dizziness, or a sense of malaise. In short, all the physical manifestations of stress. So yes, the pandemic is not 9/11, but there's some similarities. And because this is a long and difficult story, you've got to look after yourself. And so those moments of respite and resilience become so crucially important. So with that in mind, let me just shift gears and speak about trauma, because Dave gave very powerful voice to this. We've got good data now from multiple studies done over 20 years that your profession is vulnerable to the effects of trauma. Not because you're a weak profession, but because, as Dave put it so eloquently, you confront so many bad things so intensely. We have data to show that there are journalists whose careers have been defined by exposure to conflict. They've been going back to zones of conflict for 15 or 20 years. There is no other profession that does this. Veterans have a tour of duty and they come home. Perhaps they have a second tour, but they come home. I'm not aware of any other profession that has a longevity of exposure to trauma that matches yours. So I know you're young and you're starting out in a career, but be aware that this can be a major issue. And when you put yourselves on the front lines of bad things for so long, then potentially you can succumb to some of them. And so the big item that people speak about is PTSD, which I'll quickly define for you, because I think everybody think they know what PTSD is, but they don't really have a true understanding of its magnitude. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a very significant mental illness in which, in response to an overwhelming stress, that's important, overwhelming stress, you can develop symptoms that fall into 4 categories. And the first is the re-experience phenomenon, in which you have unwanted recollections or nightmares or flashbacks to the traumatic event. The second symptom category refers to avoidance, in which you want to make a conscious effort to stay away from those recollections. You try and blot them out, you try and avoid them, you distract yourself. The third symptom group refers to your body's autonomic nervous system that becomes hyper-aroused. So you can't fall asleep, or you become irritable, or your concentration is impaired, or you're in a safe place, but you're always looking over your shoulder because you perceive threat. And you may have a startle response. That's so interesting. The startle response is a physical marker of your body's memory of trauma. We experience trauma on multiple levels. We experience it on a psychological level, these thoughts, these recollections, these memories, but our body retains the physical imprint of trauma. It affects our autonomic nervous system. And the startle response is a classic example of that. Many years after exposure to a traumatic event, the traumatized person who thinks they're better still jumps when they hear a noise, or still hits the deck when they hear a noise, or they have a startle when they hear a siren. That's because your body maintains this physical imprint of trauma. And the fourth symptom group for PTSD is that you start anticipating future misfortune, and you think of future events in a negative light. You just don't look forward to it with a keen sense of anticipation or enjoyment. So to have PTSD, you've got to have symptoms from all 4 groups. And these difficulties have to be present for at least 4 weeks. So there's a recognition on the part of the American Psychiatric Association, which has defined the condition, that when you're exposed to a traumatic event, it's actually quite common to have some of these difficulties. But when this constellation persists for more than 4 weeks, that's when you have to seriously think of PTSD. What's really interesting is that a few years back, they tweaked the criteria to bring in something that's absolutely relevant to what you do. There in the small print, you now see this, that individuals who are exposed to vicarious trauma, if you're seeing it on a computer screen, for example, in theory, can develop PTSD, only if this is the nature of your work. So what they're saying is that the general public can't develop, PTSD from watching the news. But your profession, because of your exposure, hour after hour to this kind of material, via computer or audio material, whatever, that can be a significant enough stress to cause PTSD. It's a quantum shift in how we view the stressful criterion. And it's really a recognition of the work that you do, which basically led to this change in the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. A couple other points. We speak about PTSD as being the poster child, as it were, of a trauma reaction. But depression, of course, is very common in society in general, but even more common in people who do stressful work. So just be aware that depression might be a consequence of what you do. And let me touch on substance abuse because, once again, Dave mentioned it. It is very common for people to self-medicate their emotional difficulties with alcohol. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It depresses the nervous system. So in the short term, it can be quite effective. If you're anxious, have a drink, it settles you. You can't fall asleep, have a shot of spirits. It will work in the short term. But in the long term, it plays havoc with your nervous system. And it makes everything worse. So never self-medicate with alcohol, with any kind of substance. Don't self-medicate with cannabis, even though it's legal now. It's not a good idea to self-medicate. Self-medication is a form of avoidance. You're not getting to the root of what troubles you. The way to deal with that will be through talk therapy and psychotherapy. And as you've heard from Dave, talk therapy can be very effective. So there are good psychological therapies for what you experience. And I just want to conclude with a couple points. I have heard repeatedly over the years from journalists who say to me, what right do I have to complain when the people who I report on have it so much worse? And my message to you is, there is no equivalent over here. Of course, the person who has lost everything through war or disaster has it worse. We're not making a moral equivalent over here or a trauma equivalent. But what you feel is true. It doesn't negate your feelings. If you have a physical ailment, you wouldn't hesitate to get it addressed. If you broke a leg and you limped to the emergency room and the person in the bed next to you has broken 2 legs, you don't get up and hobble out the ER saying that person's got it much worse. It's the same with this. The very fact that the people you report on have it worse off than you should not be something that shames you into silence or stops you from reaching out for help. Emotional trauma can be very difficult to deal with. It can bring someone down very hard. As Dave mentioned, it spills over and can affect your family, your friends, your career, your colleagues in the newsroom. And so, there are multiple compelling reasons why you should reach out for help. Moreover, help can be very effective. And so on that optimistic note, I'd like to pass it back to Esther and be very happy to take questions from her.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the optimism. I'm going to give people some time to ask questions. I don't see any yet. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A. Sherry, if you want to make sure it's all working, that'd be great. But Dr. Feinstein, I'll throw in here, and I think Rhonda does too, while we wait for others to come forward. It's hard not seeing people, I have to say. Nice to see you folks, but my fellow panelists, but it'd be nice to see some other folks too. We hear the word resilience used a lot. Dave used it. And it's one of those things I always wonder, it's, you know, if I believe enough, will I have it? Like, how do you build resilience? And is there a difference from person to person? And how do you build resilience, right? If resilience is what's going to get you through this, how do you build resilience?
That's a great question. And you're right, resilience will differ from person to person. We all bring our own personal life experiences to things, as Dave mentioned. We all have our genetic template that can leave us potentially resilient or vulnerable to things, because we know that, you know, depression and anxiety and substance abuse run in families. So, you know, there's going to be the genetic component, there's going to be the life experience component as well. But we come back to what I said earlier, which is, you know, respite as a form of resilience becomes very powerful. You know, we need these moments of respite. They're restorative. You do not want to devote all your waking hours to your work, and your work involves a traumatic content. You need to step back from that and spend time on yourself, and don't feel guilty doing so. You know, everybody has this tremendous work ethic in which we measure ourselves by, you know, how long do we work and how effective are we in the workplace. You know, and that's a trap. Yes, we want to do good work and we want to be effective, but, you know, good journalism will depend on healthy journalists. And so to build up your resilience, you know, respite as a form of resilience becomes so crucial over here. I mean, I saw this after 9/11. I'm seeing it now with the pandemic. And for those of you in the Maritimes, of course, you have to deal with the pandemic, but you've got all the recent traumas that have come your way as well. It becomes imperative for you to step back from this and devote time to healthy pursuits, going for a jog, a bit of exercise, looking after your sleep, eating healthily, you know, some mindfulness meditation, things that you know are good for you. Focus on it, build it into your day, plan it, structure it, make sure you follow it. It's so easy to have good intentions and they go out the window because you're just overwhelmed by the volume and pace of your work. So my advice is, you know, start your day with a pen and paper and write down your moments of respite. What are you going to do during the day? The simple act of focusing your mind on that activity will make it more real for you. And keep that piece of paper next to your computer console and look at it where it says, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to phone my friends and take some time to engage socially with them. Build those kinds of moments of respite into your day-to-day, and that's how you will boost your resilience.
Thank you. And in fact, I think you answered one of the questions that's come in, which is, would you recommend meditation? And you did mention that that is a technique for building some respite.
It is. And I mean, I think, you know, meditation is part of mindfulness. I mean, I'm a big fan of mindfulness-based interventions. There's a long history of mindfulness being very effective with respect to stress reduction, and then by extension, helping you with anxiety. You know, and those of you who don't necessarily want to go and see a mindfulness therapist, there are some very good apps that can help you with that. You know, one app that I use is called Calm. And it's, you know, very skillful. It's got some really good modules that assist with sleep and relaxation. And for those of you who are looking after young children, there are now mindfulness apps with modules for children who have been very stressed by the pandemic. And those modules bring in the characters from children's storybooks like Thomas the Tank Engine, etc. You know, pulling children into this really effective therapy that can help you deal with stress.
Somebody is asking the name of that app. Perhaps we can put it up afterwards, and I'm gonna move on to some questions to Dave, and they're similar. What are your coping mechanisms that you use on the job in the run of a workday? And how have you found the best way to set boundaries at work to achieve the best balance, doing the best job possible and staying sane? Nothing small there, Dave.
Yeah. Talk to my colleagues. I'm not sure that they would say I've been successful in staying sane. So it's funny, Anthony, that you mentioned, you know, write a Post-it note, you know, with reminders of what you should do. I had great goals with my professional advisor, my therapist. It was she suggested some very simple things. Go for a walk, eat lunch, take a break. And I was like, yeah. And then I would check in the next week and she'd say, how did that go? And I'd have to say, well, not really well. And she'd say, well, why is that? Well, we get busy, and and I'm so into the story, and I'm so, and it's chasing, and we've got deadline and all this. You got to make the time. And so the Post-it note, write a Post-it note, and do it before you get to work, before you get sucked into the vortex. What are the things that you want to make sure you do? Go for a 30-minute walk, write it on the Post-it note, set a time, put it in your timer. It sounds so, I don't know, infantile that we have to put a Post-it note to remind us to eat lunch. But that's how crazy I am at work. Like, I get so invested into my work that if I don't have that little reminder, and I'll be honest, I'm not really that good at following it, but it's my best attempt. And don't beat yourself up if you don't have the perfectly balanced life. This career is not very well balanced, but that's one step. I do other things. I do make sure that I get exercise outside of work. As I've mentioned, I'm off alcohol because I found that what would happen is I'd go home at night and I'd have a glass or two or three of wine, and then I'd fall asleep and I'd wake up and I wouldn't really feel rested because the booze kind of robbed me of my proper sleep. So I've actually cut that out. And for me, that has been one of the biggest things that's helped me have the rest and be able to go into work and manage better. But one of the questions is about the way to set boundaries. This is a struggle. I think, especially with difficult stories, I think that our assignment editors are no longer tone deaf to whether the nature of the story. Like, I think we're now realizing, and there is a growing discussion and awareness, not always, in newsrooms, that difficult material requires a little bit of consent by the working journalist. And I think it's entirely appropriate, if you've had a rough story or two, for you to put your hand up and say, you know what, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't want to do another story about this. I need a break. I'm sorry. Like, give me something else. Or that's a really tough one to do, especially if you're newer to the profession and don't have as many years and you're angling for the next job, or you're only a part-time or casual employee. It's pretty hard to do, but I do think, in light of what you guys are going through, there has to be these, I don't know, I wish we could go around the circle and ask each of you, but I have to hope and pray that your bosses are clearly acknowledging the kind of magnitude of what's been thrown at you, and you're totally within your rights to say, I can't do this one, please. And if you have to escalate it as a health issue, fine. You can go that route. And I would even go so far as to argue that I at CBC, we're a federally regulated workplace. So there are things, I would say it's almost like it's not a healthy or safe work environment. If what you're being exposed to at every turn, you are forced to deal with such heavy stuff. And so I think your employer has a duty and an obligation, and I do like to believe that we are becoming more sophisticated as an industry, that people will accept and acknowledge that and support people who need to give a pass on certain stories. Anyway, I don't know if that helps answer the question about boundaries. It's a really tricky one, and I say this with the privilege of seniority and many years, and also, you know, my own insight and journey into this. But anyway, I hope that helped answer that question.
Thanks, Dave. And someone else asked, do you think journalism schools are doing enough to communicate these concerns to our students? I'll take that one and say, I think it's getting better. Promo for the forum here. That's what we do. And if you go to the website, there is a section on vicarious trauma. We have spoken, we've done other seminars. We hope to do other ones like this. I do, like Dave, believe there's been something of a change and more of an acknowledgement of how real this is. over the last few years. But there's always room for more, and conversations like this, you know, bring them back to your newsroom, talk to your colleagues. And I think we are slowly moving to a place where there's an acknowledgement of how tough this is. And I'm going to move to another question for you, Dr. Feinstein, which is from Pat, who says, how do you deal with covering the story when you know some of the victims personally? I'll use the mass shooting as an example. I knew 3 of the victims, 2 really well. Then in the helicopter crash, I knew 2 of those that died. As a lone one-man news website, I need to cover these stories for my community, but it was tough. How does one go about doing that and dealing with the emotions, sadness of what happened? Wow, Pat, I hope you've got lots of support. That's a tough one.
Yeah, you know, what a powerful question. And I think that just reinforces the message that we're putting across over here, that you've got to look after yourself. You know, but when you're reporting on a story and you don't have that distance with the victims, then potentially the emotional risks to you escalate upwards. You know, so when you have a connection to someone who has been killed or badly injured, then you are no longer the, you know, dispassionate witness. And that really brings it home much, much more powerfully to you. And in theory, it leaves you at greater risk for, you know, developing psychological distress, which can take many forms, ranging from bereavement, which is an understandable, normal and healthy reaction to loss, to major depression, which is not, which is bereavement that doesn't end, which kind of morphs into a much more ominous and severe condition called major depression. And, you know, the very nature of what you've just described potentially also leaves you at risk for something like PTSD. Of course, you may develop none of this. You know, I'm just giving you the psychiatric differential, as it were. But even if you don't get any of this, you know, your question indicates that this is very stressful and very difficult work to do. And so it becomes imperative for you to look after yourself, for you to have a good support network around you, not to be isolated, for you to be able to have those moments away from work that nourish you, that are positive, that, you know, become the antidote, as it were, to all this negativity and trauma that you have to confront in your work. And when the balance is not there, you're very vulnerable. And, you know, when those buffers are not in place and you start becoming distressed and you can't get on top of it, that's really a warning sign to reach out for help. You know, the two warning signs that I tell journalists to look out for, you know, anxiety right now is virtually ubiquitous. Anxiety in the age of the pandemic is almost like a default emotion. But when should you, you know, become worried about it? When do you reach out for assistance? I think there are 2 things to watch out for. Number one, when your emotions intrude into your work and they impede your ability to work, that's a worry. Or, if your emotions intrude into your personal life and they affect your relationships and they start unraveling because of how you feel emotionally, that's a warning sign as well. Don't hesitate under those circumstances to reach out quickly for assistance.
Can I just say one thing in response to Pat's question? Until I got to the point in your question where you said you're a one-man news site, my advice would have been you shouldn't cover those stories because you've got conflicting desires, right? You've got your own grief and your own personal connection, and then you've got your journalistic side. Now you're a one-person news site, so I empathize. I would say go very carefully, or find a non-traditional way of telling the story. I don't know how you've done it. Forgive me, I'm not familiar with your website, but you know, maybe outsource it, or use other people's testimonials to help tell the story, or inject yourself into it clearly so that it sides more from your personal. I think that's an impossible scenario for you to be in. So I feel for you, and I just take care of yourself, because that's pretty tough. That's a really, really tough scenario.
Thank you to Pat. I want to thank Pat too. I know Pat, and Pat's a real champion of his small community and does yeoman's work in telling stories and is very dedicated to what he does. So I hope Pat knows that he's got a community of journalists outside of his one-man operation that will support him and talk to him and be there for him. I have a question about emotion, Dr. Feinstein. I think you talked about when those emotions interfere and become problematic and become signs that you might need support. But, you know, I think when we cover stories like a mass shooting and suddenly we're dealing with the fact that 22 people have died, it's okay to be sad, right? It's okay to be to mourn with the community. I think it's okay if you've just spoken to a victim's family and it was a really moving conversation. I'm hoping it's okay to feel those emotions along with the people that you're talking to.
Of course, absolutely. I think it's entirely appropriate to feel that. I think it would be slightly concerning if you didn't feel that. So I think that's that's an understandable reaction to such an abnormal event. And so to feel distress and to feel a sense of horror is, I think, completely normal under those circumstances. And I think, when you look at the way psychiatry tries to make sense of all of this, built into these diagnostic criteria that guide us is a recognition that you can have symptoms of distress in the aftermath of events like this. What becomes more worrying is that when those symptoms don't abate, when they continue, when they're there for more than 4 weeks, and when they start intruding into your life and affecting your ability to work or affecting your relationships, that's when it becomes a warning sign. But, I can tell you over the course of my 20 years working with journalists, the most frequent consult that comes my way is a journalist phoning me saying, I've been exposed to something terrible, a suicide bombing in Iraq, or whatever, and I'm not sleeping well, and I feel on edge and I feel anxious. And I say, when did this happen? And they say, a couple of days back. And well, it's completely understandable that you feel this way. I'm not going to pathologize it. This is natural. Let's see what happens in the next few days and weeks. Let's monitor things. Let's bring into your life the kind of positive things that can become protective towards developing difficulties down the road. But this initial distress is entirely normal.
And Dr. Feinstein, when you say one of the important parts of this work is to normalize these emotions, we are we're human and we're effective journalists. When we connect on a human level, it would be so manipulative and unreal if you didn't feel it. I mean, your behaviors, you're not going to maybe throw your arms around people, and maybe sometimes you do, but the emotion's real. I mean, I so clearly remember sitting in an interview with a child survivor of the Holocaust, and he'd only told the story once or twice in his life. He was a man in his 50s or 60s by then. The sound man was, because his days we had full crews, the sound man was crying, he was crying, the cameraman was crying, and I was crying. And so we all just stopped for a few minutes, right? You're human, and as Dave pointed out, the more it resonates in something that's happened in your life, the deeper it's going to be as well. And we have to be aware, the self-awareness is so important.
Yep, that's true.
Dave, do you give young journalists advice when they're heading out maybe to cover their first difficult court case, or they're heading to a scene of a crime? Like, how do you help them prepare for what's ahead?
I have, in various stages of my career, played some assignment role, but I'm not really in that role. But my close colleagues, especially younger ones, when we're going out, I put this on the table. Like, the reason I take part in, I have to say, these kinds of conversations can be difficult for me. Because it's kind of dredging up, a lot of my experience, but I find it so important. So I'm grateful to take part here. But when I'm at work, I really do put it on the table in a non-confrontational way. But I'd like to remind the people around me who are sending people out to, let's be mindful of this, right? Let's think this through. Are we sure that this is going to be a good idea for the 4th day in a row for this person? And I just check in to the extent that people want to be checked in on. When I see big, horrific stories, especially the younger reporters, I make a point of just opening a channel of communication. And if they respond and want to talk, great. If not, it's a gesture. It's gotten better in my workplace. There have been real efforts to generate some discussion around this, and I know that there was the question about, is this being adequately taught in journalism schools to prepare students? Not 25 years ago when I was graduating from journalism school, but I've participated in classroom lectures and videos, interviews that I know are used as coursework and stuff. So I just think it's incumbent upon all of us, wherever you're at in this, to try to bring this conversation up, or just make it part of the checklist. You know, we've got batteries, we've got our camera, we've got our this, that, and the next thing, and are we good? Like, I've come. I don't like being critical of colleagues in the industry and all that, but I've come to this conclusion that we're really, really good at getting the story and managing stories. We're not so great at managing people. We're all nice people, most of us. We try our best and no one has ill intention, but the first thing on our minds is getting the story. It's not, let's do this in a, you know, let's be an HR company first. We're not like that. Anyway, so it's a challenge.
I think we should, I'm a manager. I manage people, I manage journalists. What could I be doing to do my job better and support people in a different way?
Well, just bringing up the conversation, checking in. And I don't know how you feel as a manager. It's a tricky line, right? Where you want to have the dialogue, but you also need that person to make up their own mind, right? About what they're capable of and what their personal health issues are, or what their personal histories and landscapes are. Like, it must be very tricky from a management point of view. So I don't know. I mean, the way CBC's done it is they make sure at every turn it's clear that EAP is available. How many people go to it as a natural instinct? I don't know. I didn't until I was in crisis.
But you knew it was there, which is what made, right? We became, and for instance, after the Williams story, we had a counselor there and there was a group session and then possibility for individual sessions, and it was just let people know about it. And I think you're onto something, Dave. I mean, as also as a newsroom manager, it's in coverage, designing the coverage of the story, and the Williams one was one of them. We built in those checkpoints and the fact that we would have that safety net at the end right from the outset. And I think by asking the question, even if people are not forthcoming, you've created an environment where it's safe. Whereas, you know, Dave started 25 years ago. I started, you know, with the horse and buggy. Being a woman was enough of a you know, strike against you, let alone showing any fear or emotion. So I think we have, you know, you have to sometimes look behind you to see how far you've come. We've got a long way to go. As Dave says, we're good at managing stories, not people. I think it becomes normalized as we build it into the process, and being mindful of who's done what, how recently, is probably a really good practice. I mean, sometimes you have no choice. But
and just following up on that, like, I was the worst. I wouldn't expose my vulnerability to my bosses because I didn't want to take
orders to pull them away for a day or two. No, it's mine.
Exactly. And I was the worst case scenario for that. People, in fact, I remember one of the assignment editors on Russell Williams calling me up and saying, you know, we're concerned, you know, we're thinking about bringing someone in. And by that point, I was so deep into it, I probably would have had a breakdown from being pulled off the story. like it. So actually, this is a good lesson. We're not always the best judge of ourselves, right? So what can newsroom managers do? Bigfoot us. Don't let our egos and our possession, I mean, trust me, I'm going to fight you when you try to take me off that story. But actually, that's an important thing that you can do.
And here's a question maybe for Dr. Feinstein. So if you're like Dave and you're not going to tell your manager that you're suffering, and you don't get big-footed, but your colleague in the desk next to you thinks there's something going on, then what should that person do if they see a change in behavior in a colleague, that kind of thing?
I mean, I do think that collegial support is very important. And I think one of the things about being a good colleague is to ask the person in the desk next to you, how are you doing? Just, quietly having a chat. I've noticed things are different. Are you okay? Just asking that question. I mean, I think to have that kind of contact with someone can be very important. And just to follow up I've been following this conversation with great interest. I think managers should check in with their journalists one-on-one from time to time, discreetly, just saying, how are you doing? Becomes an opportunity for you to acknowledge the great work that your staff are doing, but it also is a way to let people know that this is a really stressful time. We've had so many negative things happening. There's been so much bad news out there. How are you feeling? A simple question like that, I think can go a long way to letting the journalists know that someone's thinking about them. You can remind them about the EAP. I think there are ways to do that. So rather than have a culture of silence, just to quietly, discreetly ask someone, every week or so in the heat of the moment, how are you managing? How are you doing? I think is wise. And for colleagues to do it with one another, I think is a really good idea.
I have to say the pandemic, on top of the stories that we've been doing, have made it really hard to check in on each other, to have those group sessions. We did, and I know a lot of other companies did, have some trauma counseling, group trauma counseling for staff. You can't see people's reactions. You can't look them in the eye. You can't when you've got people working remotely. So it's been a challenge, particular to this time of pandemic.
But that's when the planning and the routine come into play. So you plan things in such a way that as a manager, I'm going to stay in touch with someone on a weekly basis as part of your plan, and you make a list of the people who I'm going to contact. And I'm a great plan of focus, of practice, of repetition, of structure, because it gets us into healthy things. And so as part of your weekly plan, your weekly structure, there will be this item: stay in touch with my staff. Just a quick phone call, just to reach out. So important during the pandemic because you're not seeing people. It's so easy to become isolated. And so, a quick call from you to one of your staff who's sitting at home alone in an apartment becomes even more important. It conveys such an important message to that person. So I would encourage you to do it.
I'd add one other thing, well, two other things. I remember now that CBC built into its planning on Russell Williams a debrief session. And it was a group discussion. And I went there clearly not having any problems. And what was I possibly going to get out of this? What I got out of it was the safety and the assurance, seeing that other people were having similar struggles, right? With the content, and people would kind of make jokes and say, oh yeah, and my wife thinks I'm crazy. It's like, oh yeah, really? Your wife thinks you're crazy too? I mean, maybe we're just crazy, but it actually helped validate for me the things that I was toiling with and struggling with inside. That's one thing. So debriefs after hard stories, I think, can be a positive thing. And this is totally separate from Russell Williams and all that. But during the pandemic, I have taken, so we have story meetings, and they're structured and they're run by the senior producer and all of this. But I've sort of taken, because I'm a more senior journalist with, de facto leadership, but I'm not in charge of these people. I've actually created a coffee clutch. We have a Zoom meeting where there is no agenda. And we just have a social moment. And that allows an escape valve and a way for people to talk outside of who their manager is, what the story they have to perform on. It's just a way of communing. So trying to build some social into our work environment, again, even through Zoom, has been really positive. And I know this is a little bit aside from violence and trauma, which is the theme of tonight's discussion. But I think that, Dr. Feinstein, back to what you said about checking in on your colleagues, that is a way to informally, non-big question, are you okay? But just having a little bit more community in this time of isolation is helpful.
Very much so.
So there's one more question, and then I think it might be, I'll take my cue from you, Rhonda, but time to wrap it up. And Dr. Feinstein, if you could, before I ask this last question, repeat the name of the mindfulness app you mentioned.
Calm, C-A-L-M, Calm.
Okay. And the last question is, have you ever seriously questioned whether you're in the right profession and considered leaving the industry? If so, what made you stay? I guess.
I can answer that one, and then I'll let Dave take it away. Yeah, like every week in the last 8 weeks, I think at some points I thought, this is too hard. This is too hard. Can I do this? Can I do this for an extended period of time? So, I just want to put that out there and validate how other people are feeling, if that's what they're feeling. I think I stay out of an obligation to the public. I think I see this profession as having value to the public, despite how maybe we're perceived sometimes. But it's our duty to tell stories and seek truths. And it sounds hokey, but I still believe in all of that. I stay for my team. I don't feel like I could bail on them. And I think a lot of team members feel like they can't just walk away and leave, their coworkers and their team members. So that's where I am. It's completely natural, and I know it will get better. And I keep saying, okay, this news cycle can't continue like this forever. So it's going to get better, and we're going to get to a better place. And I'm going to stick around, and I want to see that happen. Dave?
I'm going to put my email up in the chat if there are others that want to. Oops, sorry, I'm just fooling around here. Afterwards. Yeah, I've thought of leaving tons of times. I'm currently in a great job and a great place where I have the passion still after 25 years, and for all the reasons, Rhonda, that you said about serving the public, and I love the job. If I were to think of the times where I really wanted to get out, I think it's doing daily news and in the grind of it. The grind and grind and grind, and the hard stories and the long hours and the constantly being fired out of the cannon, as we say, that just takes a toll. And then when the subject matter is tough, that is the recipe for real disenchantment. The things that made me stay: finding other stories, finding other jobs too. Like, I think it's fair, if you've been on a long grind, to say, you know what, is there any way that I could get some time to work on a different story for just a little extra? Change is as good as a rest, as they say. That's helpful. I, through periods, have done a bit of hosting, which is a different set of muscles, and it's not daily out the door to interview people on the front lines of whatever the day's story is. That's one thing that's been helpful. And I mean, I'm speaking from the privilege of being more senior, and I now get to do investigative work. And I worked a long time, and I fought long and hard to be able to get out of the daily grind so that I could do that. That has built in more space for me. But there are lots of great jobs within single news organizations that aren't always just on the front line as the daily reporters. So there are ways to move around within it, still be part of the same mission, without always suffering the consequences of being fired out of that cannon. So I've been, despite all of the psychological scars that come with the job, I don't regret it. I really feel like the job that we do is so vital. It's never been more vital. As democracy crumbles south of us and truth is being assailed, I'm chapter and verse on the importance of this mission. I will evangelize journalism as being a noble profession forever, and but it's difficult. You don't escape unscathed, and I'm feeling for you guys in Nova Scotia who are. It never seems to stop. I hope you'll take some solace in knowing what an important, vital job you are doing for the public, and also know that this too shall pass. This news cycle will move on. The hurt or the pain and anguish over the people you know or the stories you've had to cover, you will process this. You will move past the point of it being immediate crisis. And if you need help doing that, take the time, get the help. So anyway, that's a long answer as to whether I wanted to leave journalism. Lots of times. I stuck with it, not entirely without personal cost. But so don't give up hope, but also don't beat yourself up if you want to try a new career. Like, that's actually not the end of the world. And it can be a great thing. I know I have lots of friends who left journalism and got out of it and said, you know what, it was the most liberating thing because I wasn't dealing with all of these problems that we've been talking about tonight. And I think there's truth to that. This is not the be all and end all. I mean, I love it. I've bought into it. But it is not a failure to say, you know what, I don't like this. I'm going to find something else. That's okay too, I would say.
Any last words from you, Dr. Feinstein? I was going to say the same thing Dave says. As a mom, I would say, you know, if you, at the end of the day this isn't working, do something else, and do not count yourself. You know, it's not a failure. It's an assessment and a self-preservation and moving on to all kinds of other things.
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I would just come back to what I said earlier. Respite as a form of resilience. I think it's very simple, but it's very profound, and it will serve you well. Respite as a form of resilience is a way to go.
All right. Well, thank you for that last thought for us to cling to. Thank you all for participating. Thanks for some great questions. I note that Dave has put up his email if people want to continue to chat. As I mentioned before, the forum has lots of resources, interviews, other places to look for information, more material from Dr. Feinstein. Please use it, and please be kind to each other. Rhonda.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you for taking part in this tonight. I think this was a really important, eye-opening, validating conversation to have. I think it reinforces messages that we've tried to put out to our teams and to each other, that if you are struggling, you have resources, you can have EAP, you have ways to deal with some of this trauma that we've been experiencing and living through this pandemic. You're not alone. And I think that's, you know, just a really great message to leave people with tonight. We have recorded this. We will share it out with other journalists in the community who aren't able to make it today. So, you know, this message will go on. And just once again, thank you so much for your time. If folks on this call haven't visited the forum website, you'll find it at journalismforum.ca. Certainly go check it out, some great resources there. And thank you once again to everyone for taking part.
Thank you to Sherry for her technical support in the background.
Yes, thanks Sherry, and RTDNA for helping us with it. All right,
Well,
thanks all.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Dave.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.